Greetings! It is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time today to continue our discussion on the Shadowrun role-playing game system, the 4th edition of it, and to discuss a little bit more on the combat side. That's what we've been talking about. Today I'm going to introduce a little bit more of the basic rules of combat. I'm going to talk about ranged combat in general, and talk about using firearms. So let's dive into it and talk about combat in general a little bit. Now there are 4 types of combat. There is ranged, which I just was talking about, melee, astral combat, and cyber combat. All of these are resolved in very similar manners. So though they themselves are different in the situations, they're resolved almost exactly the same. So let's start talking about the basics of combat. The very basics of combat is its opposed tests. That means one character, the attacker, rolls a test, and he rolls a test against the defender, who also rolls a test. If the attacker scores more hits, he successfully hits the defender. If the defender scores more hits, then the attacker has missed him with the attack. So the basic sequence of combat will start with the attacker letting someone know what sort of attack they're doing, who they're targeting, all that basic information of it. Then the defender is going to say how he or she is going to defend against this, so that we're sort of declaring it. Then we're seeing what situational modifiers apply. A lot of times there will be modifications to the situation, there will be modifications to people's dice pool. We look and see, both to the attacker and defending, what kind of modifiers might apply to those characters. Then there's the post dice checks. Both the attacker and the defender are going to roll their dice pools. They're going to roll their attribute, plus their skill, plus any of the modifiers that we've put together, whether it's positive or negative modifiers, and each of them is going to figure out their dice pool. They're going to roll it and compare it. If the attacker is higher, attack hits. Defender is higher, attack misses. If they are tied, it is considered a grazing attack. That means whatever attack it is has grazed into the person, has touched them, but has not done any kind of injury. After this, we have to move into armor and damage. We first start looking at the damage value. Each attack has a base damage value. Any net hits, that means hits over 1 you've gotten. So that means if I, as the attacker, got 3 successes, the defender only got 1, that means I have 1 cancels out his, 1 to hit him, 1 extra. Meaning me as the attacker, I can add 1 to my base damage value because I've gotten just enough to do that. You know, he canceled out 1 of my successes, 1 hits, extra damage. So if my base damage value was 6, with my 1 success it's 7. So after we've got the modified damage value, we take a look at the opponent's armor. Now we modify this by armor penetration of the attack. We also have to look at which type of armor it is. Is it ballistic or is it impact? Those are the 2 types of armor you're going to have. I'll explain the difference later, but you look at which one you have, you take it, you compare any sort of armor penetration subtracted from it, and then you look at the 2 numbers. If the armor is still equal to or higher than the amount of damage that's being dealt, it all is turning into stun damage right away, not having to do anything about it. If the damage value is higher than the armor value, then it's lethal then and there, unless it was stun damage to begin with. Now once you figure out if it's lethal or stun damage, then we have to roll. The person that's defending takes their modified armor value, adds their attribute to it, and rolls those dice. For every success they get, for every hit they get, they subtract 1 from the damage to a total of whatever the damage is going to be. So that's subtracting down on the damage. If it goes down to 0, then the attack is effectively negated, you take no damage. If it's not reduced to 0, then any of the remaining damage is applied to the person, the defender, and they take the damage finally. So let's move into talking about ranged combat. Now ranged combat works on those basic combat rules I said, but ranged combat has their own list of modifiers you're going to have to look at. You're going to have to look at what kind of ranged weapon you're attacking with. After that, you have to check how far away you are, what range you're at. Now depending on the range you're at, there's a chart in the book that will tell you if you have modifiers to your attack. If you're within a certain distance, you're not going to be modified. As the farther you get, you're going to get more dice pool penalties because it's going to be harder to hit as farther away. So that's the first thing you look at. Then you're also going to look at the visibility. Depending on what kind of sight you have, what kind of lighting it is out, you might get more modifiers to your attack. If you're just a normal human with normal eyes, not any kind of special cyber eyes or any kind of devices to see in the dark, and you're in total darkness, you're going to have a pretty big penalty to your dice pool to attack someone. And there's, of course, a miscellaneous chart of modifiers. These are such things as the modifiers you get for running while shooting, modifiers for being damaged in shooting, taking aim, what you get bonuses using a smart gun, being in melee combat, or the target having cover. There's a whole list of them, and they describe how they effectively little work, so you're thinking if they work or not, and what kind of bonuses are listed in the book here. Now, when you're defending against a ranged attack, there are no skills which add to that. That's the thing you're going to have to think of right away. No skills. You're just going to roll your reaction when defending against a ranged attack. Now, if you do take the total defense action, you can get more dice to this check, to defenses. Let's start talking about firearms. Now, firearms have a number of modes of fire. The modes of fire that your firearm is going to be listed under that gun. Some of them may only have one type of mode of fire. Others might have multiples. If you have multiples, you're going to have to switch between them, which, depending on your setup, may or may not be an action. It might just be something you can do very quickly. It might have to be something that you actually have to take an action to switch between these different modes. So let's talk about these firing modes. There's single shot, which is you can only get one of in a turn. Semi-auto, which you can do it equivalent to as many simple actions you can take in a turn. You can get a number of semi-auto shots out. There's also burst fire, which you can do a narrow burst or a wide burst. A narrow burst, it adds extra damage. A wide burst, it subtracts defense from the person you're trying to shoot at. So one of them you're trying to do more damage, the other one you're making it harder for them to avoid your attack. Both have their merits. Now, everything from semi-auto on does have basic rules for hitting multiple targets with these attacks. Something like a semi-auto, you can shoot two different ones. Other ones with something like a burst fire, normally you can either do two different bursts at two different people, or you could try to swath people with a burst. There's rules for that, and it will tell you what kind of modifiers you're going to get when attempting to hit multiple targets with this sort of wide variety of shots. Now, moving on from that is the full automatic. From burst fire on, they also do talk about having less bullets than normal and trying to do any of these. It effectively subtracts damage or subtracts penalties that you're giving someone for each bullet less than what you would have for doing these maneuvers. Now let's move on to the full auto mode. Now, full auto is by itself a complex action, but there's two different types of full auto. There's the long burst and the full burst. The difference is, of course, the number of bullets and the penalties you're getting. A long burst, you're not going to get as many penalties because it's going to have less of a recoil, but a full burst, you're going to have more bullets, more possible damage. Both of these also have choice, whether you're making them a narrow burst or a wide burst. Both of them have that choice. So you would look at what you want to do. Again, do you want to do extra damage or you subtract defense? Granted, when you're subtracting a lot of dice, maybe a wide burst might be better, I would say, for full auto, just because you're making it harder for them to dodge out of the way when you're going to have not many dice to hit them in the first place anyway, with the kind of penalties you can get. But anyway, there is an action you can do when using full auto. There's suppressive fire. You effectively make your check, and you're covering an area in bullets, and if any person that would be a defender within that area attempts to move or move out of whatever cover they have a chance of getting hit by some of those bullets. So they would have to make a check to avoid some of those bullets, and if not, they would take the base damage of your weapon. So effectively, you're just spraying bullets in an area just to keep people from moving around. Now, last thing I want to mention is ammunition, because if you're using weapons, you may or may not have to switch out ammunition at some point. You might have to reload. You might have to worry about the types of ammunition, how much ammunition you have, depending on the situation you're in. If you're in a very long adventure where you're breaking into some place and you're fighting your way through it, and you're actually having a lot of combats, you might have to worry about running out of bullets. Now, all the guns, when you look at their stats, they're assuming you're using regular ammunition. There are other types of ammunition, and if you look at the other types of ammunition, it will tell you how they modify your gun statistics. Some of them might increase their damage. Some of them might increase their armor penetration. A type of ammo could make it stun damage. There are a lot of varieties of ammunition you can choose from. And whichever one you're going to assume is loaded in. When you're loading up a gun, assume you have all the same ammo in that clip. Keep it to that. Your game master is probably going to have you keep it to that because it keeps it a little simpler and it keeps it a little easier that you're not being crazy, that you're mixing and matching in a magazine, because it doesn't really work very well, especially if you're doing something like a full auto burst with a whole lot of different bullets. You can't calculate that chaos that's there. So assume it's all the same type and you have enough to fill up clips. So that's it for today. That's all I really wanted to talk about. I went over the basics of combat, talking about the sequence you run through, and then I began talking about ranged combat, where I talked about mainly the basics of ranged combat and firearms. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Great way of showing your support for the channel and the Empire. Please subscribe if you already haven't. We're always looking for more members, more citizens. And please share this video if you know anybody that would learn anything from it or would just enjoy watching it. And until the next time, I bid you farewell.